It started on a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was browsing a used bookstore in the quieter part of town, one of those dimly lit places with shelves packed tight with old, worn paperbacks. The smell of dust and aged paper filled the air. I liked these kinds of places. There was something calming about being surrounded by forgotten stories that I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but then, in the back corner of the store, I saw it. An unmarked, leather-bound book resting alone on a small table. No title, no author, just a plain black cover. Curious, I picked it up and flipped it open. The first page didn't have a typical title or introduction, just the simple phrase, "This is the story of your life." That I smiled to myself, thinking it was some kind of interactive or experimental novel. Feeling intrigued, I decided to buy it. The cashier, a gray-haired man with round glasses, barely glanced at me as he rang me up. "Interesting choice," he muttered, though I wasn't sure if he meant it or was just making small talk. Later that evening, as the rain continued to patter against the windows, I settled into my favorite armchair and began reading. The story started slowly, describing a man in his mid-30s living a quiet, routine life. He worked a stable but unexciting job, lived alone in a modest apartment, and spent his evenings much like I was, reading or watching TV. I found it amusing how much I related to the character. But then, the details began to hit a little too close to home. The man in the book had the same job I did. The same apartment layout, the same routines, right down to the odd little habit of drinking tea before bed and checking the locks twice before going to sleep. I laughed nervously, figuring it was just an eerie coincidence. But I kept reading. As I turned the pages, I felt an uncomfortable tension creeping in. The protagonist's life became a mirror of mine in ways that went beyond coincidence. Events from my past, the death of my parents when I was young, the car accident I'd survived in my 20s, were all laid out in stark detail. I set the book down for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I stared at the unmarked cover, my hands shaking slightly. That it had to be a prank, right? Someone had found out about my life and written this book as some elaborate joke. But who would go to such lengths? And why? I couldn't help myself. I had to keep reading. Maybe there would be some clue, some explanation in the later chapters. But what came next was far worse than I could have imagined. The book began to describe events that hadn't happened yet, things that were happening as I read. The character, now clearly me, was sitting in his armchair on a rainy night, reading a strange book. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the next lines. He glanced nervously at the clock, wondering if perhaps he had been sitting too long, wondering if someone was watching him from the shadows. I froze. The description was precise, down to the clock on my wall, which read 9:47 p.m., just as it did in the story. Sweat began to bead on my forehead. I quickly glanced around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was indeed watching me. That I forced myself to keep reading, even though my hands were trembling now. The story took a dark turn. The character began to feel an ever-growing sense of dread, an inexplicable fear that he was being followed. The book described him seeing shadows moving in the corner of his vision, catching glimpses of a figure that was always just out of sight. A killer, lurking just beyond the edges of his awareness, waiting for the right moment. My heart raced as I continued. The book described how the character started hearing footsteps behind him, even though no one was there. He'd find doors unlocked that he swore he'd locked. Windows slightly ajar that he hadn't opened. Every moment, the presence drew closer, and then I read the sentence that made my blood run cold: the killer would make his move tonight, at exactly 10:15 p.m. The man would hear a knock at his door, and by then, it would be too late. I glanced at the clock again, 9:58 p.m. I slammed the book shut, tossing it across the room like it had burned me. This wasn't possible. This was insane. I tried to calm myself, pacing the room, convincing myself that it was all just a weird coincidence or a bad joke. But the fear gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the book knew something I didn't. Then came the sound. A faint, barely audible knock at my door that I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, my mind racing. It was probably nothing. Someone in the building could have knocked on a neighbor's door, or maybe it was just the wind rattling something outside, but then I heard it again. Louder this time. More insistent that I backed away from the door, heart hammering in my chest. The book had said the knock would come at 10:15 p.m. I checked the clock again, 10:14 p.m. A deep, cold terror took hold of me. I didn't want to know who, or what, was on the other side of that door. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the numbers. But when the dispatcher answered, I found I couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come. I stood there, mouth open, trying to force the words out, but all that came was silence. My throat felt tight, as if something was squeezing the life out of me. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. I dropped the phone and ran to the back of the apartment, locking myself in the bathroom. I could still hear the knocking, pounding in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Then, after a few minutes, it stopped. I waited in the bathroom for what felt like hours, but no more knocks came. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, the apartment was eerily quiet. I slowly approached the front door, holding my breath as I peered through the peephole. Nothing. No one was there. But as I looked down, I saw something lying on the floor, a single page torn from the book. I bent down, my hands trembling, and picked it up. Scrawled in large, messy handwriting across the page were the words, "This is only the beginning." I never found the book again after that night. I've looked everywhere, even went back to the bookstore, but the old man just shrugged. He said he didn't remember ever selling me such a book. He didn't remember me at all. Now, I live in constant fear, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Because somewhere out there, the story isn't finished. And I know the killer is still coming.